Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well today. This is a little video that I'm going to be calling Monster Minutes. That's going to be talking about playing monsters in the new edition for Middle-earth. If you haven't been living under a rock in the Middle-earth community, the new edition has had quite a bit of a glow-up for monsters with some of the changes they've received, and I like to think of myself as a monster connoisseur in a way, as I have, in my entire Middle-earth career, I've only played 2 games without a monster on my side. With that in mind, going into the changes for them and then some strategies you can use for monsters of how to get the most out of them when you're playing them in your game, especially now that they're going to be a little bit more viable and a little bit more relevant in the game. I kind of thought it would be a good idea to talk about some of the strategies that I have learned about, used, and then various things that you can do to get the most out of your monsters. One of the big changes is that we're going to go over the changes and then go over strategy afterwards. One of the big changes is when a monster makes a strike on a model and successfully removes it as a casualty, that means any model that was supporting that model, the monster can now make an additional strike on. So it's the same strength as their normal attacks, and it's free. So if you have a monster with 3 attacks engaged by 3 guys, you can hit each of them once, potentially, and kill them. And then anyone supporting them you can also hit, even if you've used all your attacks. In an ideal world, a monster with 3 attacks can remove 9 models by killing a model that's engaged with it, and both pike supports, because it can hit both pike supports, or a spear support. So 3 models engaged with 2 pike supports means a monster could potentially, if it rolled really, really well, get 9 kills. Obviously not super likely, but that is something to keep in mind. The big thing being that it's free extra strikes and on any supporting model. Another one is that basically all monsters have gained Dominant 3 or more. But Dominant 3 I'm pretty sure is the minimum across all monsters. And then as you get any bigger hero monsters or some of the larger trolls, they go up to Dominant 4. Some of the hero monsters like Sauron or the Balrog having Dominant 10. And so on. This is a big deal because it helps them contest points better, but going on to the brutal power attacks that all monsters have access to, just like heroic actions, so there's the 3 generics that all heroes have access to, all monsters have access to 3 generic brutal power attacks. We will go over those because 2 of them have changed, one quite a bit. We won't go over the specifics of any specific monster or any specific brutal power attacks, because a lot of monsters have their own unique BPAs, but for most monsters they're using the generic 3, and then a lot of the named ones will tend to have unique ones. If you would like a video going over unique monster brutal power attacks and their use cases in the new edition, please like the video, leave a comment letting me know that you would like to see that. Because there's a lot to go into with basically each monster having a unique brutal power attack and how to use it. But if people would like me to go through that, I will more than happily do that. One of the big things about brutal power attacks is, or also known as BPAs, is you can only use once per turn per monster. So if you have 3 monsters, they can all use a brutal power attack, no problem, but they can only use 1 brutal power attack. And that'll come up later with Barge for why you can only use 1. So with the first generic brutal power attack, we've got Rend. Basically all this does is it makes a number of wound rolls against the selected model equal to the attack characteristic of the model. Meaning that all the attacks have to go into 1 and they're not strikes. Brutal power attacks are not strikes like normal attacks are. But you rend a model, you put all your attacks into that model effectively, and then you are wounding your strength versus their strength instead of defense. So the big named heroes, the heroes of legends, the Aragorns, the Boromirs, the people that are strength 4 D8, strength 4 D7, strength 4 D9 for dwarves and stuff like that. Rend allows the monsters to get through that because now you go from wounding on 5s for a lot of the monsters against D8 and D9 to now you're probably wounding on 3s against their strength 4. So this allows monsters to get through larger defense heroes with a lot more ease, but the important thing to remember is that it's not strikes, so it doesn't benefit from a model being trapped. So a monster with 3 attacks can rend the hero for 3 dice, or if they're trapped, they could throw 6 dice at it. But if you're wounding on 5s, the 3s from the rend is going to more consistently get you 2 wounds. So if you just need to get 1 or 2 wounds through, the rending's right. But if you need to get like 3 or more wounds through to like secure the kill, if you really need to secure it, just roll the 6 dice. And especially if it's a monster and you have might behind those dice, it can make it a lot more effective to remove something that has a lot of fate or a lot of wounds left still. But if you're going for those few couple of wounds, the rend can be good. And then if they're not trapped, it's basically just free, right? And that's only an indication for when they're trapped, because the rend will not double dice because it doesn't count as strikes, so it doesn't care if they're trapped. So Barge is mostly the same as what it used to be. Barge is when the duel roll is resolved and you go into the strikes, you call the barge, nothing else happens. The monster that is barging makes all of the models move away 3 inches, and that's the monster's controlling player gets to decide how the enemy models back away 3 inches, including making ways from any like spear supports or anything else. Those will also have to make way 3 inches instead of the normal inch. And then after everything is backed away, the monster that barged gets to move again, and it's D3 plus 3 inches of movement. So you'll roll a die and get either 1, 2 for 1, 3, 4 for 2, 5, 6 for 3 inches on top of the base 3. So you're guaranteed 4 inches up to 6 inches of movement. So no matter what, if you are trying to do a longer barge, you can always charge back into the guys you barged, because they will be within 4 inches because they can only move back 3. But if the models engaged with the monster can't back away 3 inches, they back away as far as they can and then are put prone. Otherwise, the biggest change is just getting that D3 plus 3 inches compared to the last edition, allowing it to be a lot more consistent at getting the charges off, because it was D6 last edition. And the other caveat is you can't heroic combat and barge in the same turn. So a monster, whether it's a normal monster with a hero in combat or a hero monster, if they heroic combat, they cannot then barge in the next fight to move again and do another fight. So it's only one or the other. And then the third and final generic brutal power is Hurl. So Hurl has changed a lot from its previous iteration. The way how it works now is after winning the fight, the monster can elect a single monster that it was, or a single model that it was fighting, and then you can roll a D3, just like for the barge. You roll the D3, add that to the difference in the strength characteristic of the monster and the elected model. So for most warriors, it's 3. Most most monsters will be 6 or 7. So you're going to be looking at 3 to 4 inches before you add on the D3. So looking at probably 5 to 7 on average for the distance on the Hurl. Then roll an intelligence check. If passed, the monster's controller then elects a second model within range based on the roll and the strength difference to hurl the model at the other model. The hurled model will take 2 strength 6 hits, and the targeted model will take 1 strength 6 hit and be knocked prone. So if it's cavalry, it'll automatically suffer the knocked flying rule. And if the thrown model lives, it is placed in base contact with minimal disruption of the models around the target. So if you have to move models to make it fit, you do that as small, like as little as possible to make that thing fit. If you fail the intelligence check, though, then the opponent chooses one of their models within the throw range, so they can't make you target your own model, has to still hit one of theirs, and same rules apply then. 2 hits to the throw, 1 to the target, but they're just choosing one of their models as the target instead. If it's a cavalry monster, like the Witch King on Fellbeast, you can use the rider's intelligence instead of the monster's. So it makes smart monsters have a lot more consistent utility in their hurls, whereas like a lot of non-hero monsters like the trolls are a little less consistent at their hurls. But you can still throw it at something of your opponent's choice, and then if there's nothing in range to be a valid target, you throw it within line of sight, within range that you rolled, and just throw the model on the ground, and then it just takes the hits as normal. And for the target model needs to be below strength 6 to be knocked prone, so you can't hurl and knock other monsters prone with hurl. It's only for knocking over basically normal warrior infantry. Also, another thing, this has the same caveat as the barge. You can't heroic combat and hurl in the same turn. So, and it's not, you can't do it in the same combat, it's you can't do it in the same turn. So you can't have a monster participate in heroic combat, go into a new combat, and then hurl one of those guys. And you can't heroic combat and hurl the guy as well. So a little bit of a limitation there with heroic combats for 2 of the 3 generic ones. A big change to remember from last edition to this edition is it's only the elected models that are affected, so the one that's chosen in the combat and then the target are the only ones that are affected by the hurl. So it's not like going bowling like it was in the last edition, it's more like an overhead, just like lob it over and smack it down right on the target you're going for. So no bowling alleys with the monsters anymore. So it's made hurl more consistent and better on non-flying monsters, or at least ones that have normal movement of 6 inches. And it's still kind of better on flying monsters because a lot of them tend to be a little smarter than like trolls, for example, but it's not as able to force positioning as the same as before. As for strategy for the various like brutal power attacks and monsters, starting with Rend, like I was saying, if you don't have a trapped model and there's just one model you really want to kill, you can just Rend it, focus it down. If you're changing from wounding on 4s to 3s and the model's trapped, it's not worth it. But going from 5s to 3s, if you only need 1 or 2 wounds, the rending is still worth it. Whereas if you need to try and spike the 3, 4, or 5 wounds, you obviously can't do that with 3 dice. Go for the 6 and hope that you roll what you need to, right? Always play to your outs there. Barge, honestly, has, with the consistency of it going up in conjunction with strike nerfs, large monsters can really pressure a lot of heroes really well. One of the big things is you have a big monster like a Sauron or a Balrog, and they heroic combat off of something, and there's an enemy hero nearby, so they defensively strike or defensively heroic defense because they know that you're going to likely win the combat and then go into their hero. With the barge changes, it makes it to where someone like Sauron can be close to an enemy hero, not have to call a heroic combat, but pretty consistently get that movement to get into the hero. So then if your opponent isn't thinking about it, they can't react to it with a heroic because it's happening during the combats. Or they have to go, man, he could barge into me. I need to call this defensive heroic, and it costs 0 might on your end. So it's just basically a free 1 might expenditure from your opponent that you get, because then you can either just fight the monster normally and just fight in the combat normally, or you could barge into another target, especially if you get something big like Sauron next to 2 heroes and they have to both defensively heroic, then you're just like in the gravy with Value Town there. And another thing I hinted at in the beginning description is, since you can recharge the guys that you push back guaranteed because they're going to be within 4 inches, if you are against a model that's not prone or not trapped, but you can barge them in a way that can make them trapped, because you can't force them to move less than 3 inches to make them trapped, but if they have no way to get that 3 inches of movement to not be trapped, you can barge, go into that specific likely hero that you're wanting to kill, and now when you win the fight, you're doubling your strikes, which is a big deal. So you can kind of double your killing power, assuming you can win the fight again. But there's less risk because they've gone prone, so even if they do win the fight, they're not striking your monster back. But that is something to consider if you really need, like, in 1 turn to put the hurt on someone, especially since you're probably already beating them in fight value. Since you won the first fight, you can do that. Probably wouldn't do it if they have the fight value on you, because you already took the 1 win off of them. The chances of you getting the second one is not as good, but sometimes you'll be forced in the situation where you just have to hope the dice are in your favor anyway. So, but it is something that you can consider of how to get trap models for your monsters to strike into that you normally wouldn't be able to. This is probably the nichest of the tips I just said, but because you can make strikes on spear supports when you win the fight, you can have a warrior that's engaged with you, and assuming the spacing's right, you can back them up into spear supports or pike supports and then recharge them. And now those supports are in that fight, and then when you win, you can get extra kills. So if you have like 2 guys engaged with you and can push them both back into a spear support and then recharge both of them, you can go from killing 2 guys to potentially killing 4 guys with basically free resources and just getting a little bit of repositioning too, if that's something you want as well. So that's not something I've been able to pull off in a game yet, but it's something I've thought of, where if your opponent is trying to position things to where they don't have their spear supports in the fight, you can barge them to be in position to where now these spear supports that seemed safe are now at risk of dying. You can also use barge defensively if there is a position where maybe your opponent traps like a Witch King on foot or a different hero like a Mouth of Sauron on foot, and you have a troll nearby, and the opponent like calls a strike or a strength. The monster, or him just being trapped, is not good for his likelihood to survive. You can barge and then hopefully peel the hero off, because then your monster isn't trapped, and most heroes against monsters are going to struggle without them being trapped to one-shot them. You really need a second hero or trapping them to get that one-shot potential really going. But being able to use it defensively to peel guys off other fights that could be killing a crucial piece like a banner or a hero can be something to consider. Another just tool in the arsenal of Barge, where it can threaten a lot of things for free aggressively and can make might wasted aggressively as well by using it defensively. Another thing to consider with Barge when using it, this is kind of aggressively and defensively, is for objective control. If there are a bunch of models on a point, the monster is likely dominant 3 or 4, so it's going to count for multiple models. But if you have a dominant 3 monster that goes into a point that's contested by 8 enemy models, if you're able to charge 2 or 3 of those guys, and maybe they're spear supported, you could barge them off the point, because 3 inches is going to get them off the objective, and then charge into 1, 2, or 3 of the other guys, or maybe they're spear supporting, and then all of a sudden you can basically flip a point in one turn without any might expenditure, because you push the guys off, go in and kill the other ones, and on a turn where the game's ending, where either you know it's ending or there's a good chance for it to end, that is something where you can kind of flip a point in one turn and use the barge very strategically to try and win a point that seemed like the opponent had locked up otherwise. So for the third one, Hurl, if you have a monster that's smart enough to hurl consistently, which are things like Ring Wraiths on Fell Beast. The Witch King can do it pretty consistently, but I think a lot of the time you're not going to want to be doing it consistently with the Witch King, because he can do so much killing, especially right now with the verdict being out on whether Monstrous Charge and Cavalry Charge is supposed to stack. Rules as written, they do. There's nothing saying that Monstrous Charge replaces Cavalry Charge like the last edition does. So a Ring Wraith on Fell Beast going into non-cavalry models that are not non-cavalry models means that the Witch King with 3 attacks can go up to 5 attacks on the charge against non-cav models, which is huge for his killing power, because when you knock things prone and you're rolling 5 dice doubled to 10, you're just killing everything at strength 6 from the Fell Beast. There's very few things that'll survive that. Smart monsters that can consistently hurl, or even just average ones that you are still more than likely to get the hurl off, can kind of be good, and you can always Hail Mary it with dumb monsters. There's nothing that if you need to do it. But Hurl's power goes up dramatically when you have priority, and drops drastically when you don't have priority. Because of you not being able to benefit from using Hurl during an heroic combat, that means that having the ability to dictate when that fight happens and when your Hurl happens is huge, because what can end up happening is you can have a hero that calls a striker strength. You have a monster nearby who now that hero is probably into a different monster or a hero that it's really trying to kill, and you just hurl, knock that guy down. Sure, he strikes up above your fight value. Sure, he strengths to double his strength for the turn for the fight phase for strikes, but it doesn't matter because he's not making strikes if he wins the fight. So you basically burn a point of might for no cost on your side, other than maybe losing a little bit of killing power with the monster, but saving your other thing is probably well worth the 1 or 2 models you might have killed otherwise. And you can just sometimes put a wound on the hero too. The 1 strength 6 hit wounds things pretty easily. If they're a D7 or D8 large hero, sure, it's on 5s, but that's not impossible to just get a free wound out of it too, as long as you're killing the guy you're hurling. So this can force heroic combats out of your opponents when they might not want to, because they just need the fight to happen first. Or heroic defenses because they can go prone, and then if they lose the fight, they could just die with the doubled dice otherwise. Another thing is, because it knocks both models prone, is you can hurl at a banner, and assuming you don't kill the banner, and it's like, because they probably have something near it to bodyguard it to pick it up, you can hurl at the banner, and as long as you don't kill it, the banner is now prone. So that is an option you can do, because that turns the banner off for the turn until it can stand back up. So being able to hurl at a banner, and then in that situation, you honestly are typically hoping to not kill it if there's something for them to pass off to. But even if they do, you might be creating a 2-on-1 in the battle line that they had front line spear support, banner, and base contact, and so the banner passed off to the spear, but now that spear support can't spear support, so that fight now is a 1v2, so you're more likely to win that fight. So even if you do kill the banner, it can create a battle line misalignment that's beneficial for you. And if you don't kill it, you've turned their banner off for the turn, which can be huge, and really, especially against an army that has a higher fight value than you, can really hamper their ability to win fights. Another use for hurl is kind of like a last resort, where let's say one model got into your monster and tied it down, and the fight's kind of moved around in ways, and barging them, you can't get into any better targets. You might get into one other warrior and get 2 kills instead of 1. Well, then you can do the hurl, because it's like, who cares at that point? You can threaten 2 kills anyway with the hurl, but you can use it to threaten a horse, because any hero hit by it is getting knocked off their horse, and then also they're not able to make strikes because they're going to go prone. So not only are you threatening 2 kills still, but if you're able to threaten a hero target, it can be a huge deal, because all of a sudden a hero that's against 2, 3, or 4 infantry, but they're prone and lose the fight because they fluff, they can all of a sudden just die, because that'll be 6 or 8 dice coming their way, even when it's strength 3 or maybe strength 4 if it's like Morannon's. A lot of heroes can all of a sudden take a bunch of wounds from that when they thought they were pretty safe before. And when you have the priority at basically being an unresistible transfix in a way, because yes, they can still call heroics, but them not being able to make strikes is the big one, means that they are turned off for the turn on the threat. If they're a horse, you got 20 points of value, if not more, if it was an armored horse or a fancy horse. So just getting 20 points in the bag from your monster, as well as potentially wounding the hero, as well as if they lose their fight they're in now, they could just take a lot of wounds, if not just be removed from the board entirely. So barge and hurl kind of cover all your bases with getting tagged down with like one dude, because you can do one of those and hopefully get more value out of just than the one kill on the single model. So, and just a little side note, obviously monsters as a whole I think are better than they were last edition. I don't think that they are the end-all be-all of this edition. I think as time goes on and people learn to play against them, their efficacy is going to drop. But just like last edition, the hero monsters are so much better than the non-hero monsters. Having might to adjust the wound roll, or to adjust dual rolls, having fate to have more wounds than the non-ones. They're just way more consistent at winning fights. They might have access to strike to make it even easier for them to win fights against other heroes. Like a fight 8 monster with strike against a fight 7 hero, the strike off is so in your favor. 8 fight, you're gonna 2/3 of the time hit fight 10, whereas a fight 7 hero is only 1/3 of the time gonna hit fight 10. And the only way for them to beat you is for you to roll a 1 or 2 and them to roll a 5, 6. So only 1 out of 9 times with a strike off, when you have the fight value advantage by 1 point, will you lose. If you have the advantage by 2, only 1/9 of the time will you tie, otherwise you win all the time. So striking off in this game is a lot worse, which makes the monsters a lot better. So fight 8 monsters, even without strike against fight 5 and fight 6 heroes, striking is very risky, because a fight 8 monster with a 6 hero, yes, if they roll a 5 or 6 they beat you, but most of the time they're tying or losing. And a fight 5 hero has to spike the 3 just to tie now. So they are better in that regard, but the heroes are still better having the heroic actions, typically strike, and being able to call the combats. Being able to go into a battle line, combat, kill the front 2, get extra strikes on the back 2, and then slide over into the next 2 guys of the battle line and do the same thing, and basically wipe 4 models off the board for each combat, is a huge deal for making these monsters just like line breakers. And I have been able to use it with the 3 trolls really effectively. The 3 trolls, all being 3 hero monsters, have been able to go in, 1, 2, or 3 of them call heroic combat, kill their frontline dudes, get a kill or 2 on the back, go into the next dudes, and you basically get like 15 to 20 kills in 1 turn of combat, and a lot of armies are just broken or basically broken after 1 turn of combat. So you have to be very careful playing against monsters, because you can really punish mispositioning and misplaying with the monsters now. It can just kind of be 1 turn and the game goes from being it's just started to it's over, which is really, I think, can be thematic for the monsters. I think them doing the punch through to the supports is thematic, but it can be very punishing and brutal for the opponent if they don't position well and lose a lot of their fights, which, since the monsters have the fight value on almost everything, they probably are going to be losing a lot of fights. Another reason that the hero monsters are better, they have the will, and so a lot of them will have like resistant to magic or a way to deal with enemy magic, because that is the best way to shut down monsters still, is a transfix, as a lot of the monsters just don't have the ability to stop that, and unnamed non-hero monsters definitely don't. The 0 will, and if they're lucky to have resistant to magic from something, is their only chance to stop a transfixed. As well as like Sorcerer's Blast can knock down a monster, so it makes it a big deal of knocking them prone so they can't strike if they win, and then if they lose they could just die. Even hero monsters have to be concerned about that. The heroic stats really make a big difference between the monsters, and having played with non-hero monsters and hero monsters a decent amount this edition, the hero monsters are still way far and away better than the non-hero monsters, but they both are better than their previous iteration for sure. One of the, I think, best options for the non-hero monsters, because they're typically like fight 7, is they can bully mid-tier heroes really well, because a fight 5 hero striking into a fight 7 troll or something like that is not very, they don't like that, because a lot of the time they're going to be tying or losing still, and you're happy with that, because the chances of them doing a lot of damage to you in 1 turn is not nearly compared to what you're going to do to them in 1 turn, and you burn a point of might every time that happens. Making sure that they are either line breaking when your opponent gives the opportunity to do that, and making sure that you're bullying the mid-tier heroes, the captains, without strike, or anything that's like fight 5 with strike with your unnamed heroes can be really a way to get value out of them a lot easier than just putting them into some regular dudes in normal combats. But also remembering that the monsters are not invulnerable, they're not invincible by any means. Even without being trapped, all it takes is a couple of heroes or some stronger troops, and they can remove a monster in 1 turn, no problem, especially if they get it trapped, and that includes heroes. But especially non-heroes, you have to be careful with their positioning, just like your opponent has to be careful positioning against them. So the 2 big things are support and positioning, which will be what your opponent is looking to do and what you need to be doing with your monsters. As one of those goes up or down, the other one should balance with it. If they can both go up, that's great. But if, let's say, your positioning is going down, your positioning's worse, whether it's from texture of the board, of the game, or just the army matchup, you have to make it up with positioning or support. So if your support drops, you got to make it up with positioning. If your positioning drops because of the texture, you got to make it up with support. So whether that's getting warriors nearby to peel things off or prevent it from being trapped, whatever it ends up being, you need to do that, so that way you don't just lose your monsters, because if you have even just 1 monster, it's a huge deal when it falls, because that's a huge chunk of your army. With it being probably around 100 points, that can be a fifth of your army at 500 points that's just gone. And even at 700 points, you don't really just want to lose 100 points for nothing. You really want to get some value out of them first. So making sure to pay attention to the matchup of the army and the texture of the board and scenario, and support and positioning. As one goes down, the other one needs to compensate for it, which is very doable, but if not done correctly, can just easily mean a flash killed monster. Part of this will come to look at how your opponent can deal with the monster. If they have magic, it's probably just going to be magic, and you just kind of have to accept that for non-hero monsters. But otherwise, figuring out like, oh, they have this great hero killer, or this great hero that's at removing monsters, or their troops are really strong, so any trap from their troops could mean a removed monster. avoiding that and making sure that you're doing everything you can to make that as hard as possible for your opponent will be very, very beneficial. As well as sometimes it'll be, you can use the monster as bait where they see this 100-point model that it's like, oh, I want to remove that from the board, and they've mispositioned it. You can use that to your advantage. If you might be sacrificing your monster, but it might be putting the other half of their army in a bad position or a hero in a bad position, and all of a sudden you trade your 100-point monster for a 150-point hero on the opponent's side, remove some might off the table, and that's a trade you're happy to take almost every day. Removing might is huge. Especially in the early days of this edition, it's looking like might can be a little bit more scarce for a lot of armies, so anytime you're removing might from the table is a big deal. And don't be afraid to use it as bait when you think you can use it to your advantage, even with the monster going down. And like I was kind of saying with the barge, where if you can get 2 heroes that need a defensively heroic against a monster that can barge, anytime you can get 2 or more of the strategies that I was talking about for a monster online, it makes it that much harder for your opponent to play around all of them, makes it that much harder for your opponent to realize all of them. So even if they are seeing some of the things you're doing, that might miss one, and even if they do catch everything, you're adding to the mental tax. The mental stack in their brain is just getting weighed down by the options your monster is presenting against them, and then that could also help you out in the long run. So just making sure that it's threatening them as much as possible, as safely as possible, is the big thing, and a monster on the board is more effective than one off the board, so overextending it for some value might not be worth it over the course of the game versus sticking it out and getting a lot of value. With the diversity and flexibility of monsters as threats now, where really Hurl was only viable by flying monsters for a lot of the time, and because like I've used Hurl basically every game I've played with a monster in this edition, whereas I used Hurl I think once the entire time last edition, and that was with, like I said, only one of my probably hundreds, or at least close to 100 games last edition. And I played a monster in every game but one. I hurled once, whereas I've almost probably averaged a hurl every game this edition, where there might be a game where I don't hurl, but there's other games where I'm probably hurling 3 or 4 times in the game based on the context of the match. So hurl is, I think, less niche, but I think it will in the long run potentially be more frustrating to play against because of how it interacts with opponents' heroes and such. But anytime you can use your monsters to leverage strategies to create suboptimal plays from your opponents, even if they're not getting a lot of point value, with tangible removing points from the board, the disruption is also point value that you need to take into consideration as well. This isn't a fully extensive list of how to use monsters in the new edition, but kind of going over their basic changes from last edition to this edition, and I'm sure I've forgotten some things, but it should be a pretty decent foundation for anyone starting out either with the game or picking up monsters after the buff and the nice buff and shine they've received and maybe wanting to give them a spin. If you think that there's anything drastic that I'm missing, and that would kind of be in a Monster 101 book, please let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I hope that this can help you with some of the basic strategies for monsters in the new Middle-earth. Thanks. Have a good one.